Tennessee, 1893. A child stands at the edge of a freshly dug grave, dirt beneath her fingernails, sweat mixing with tears on her face. But this isn't a funeral. Her mother isn't dead. Not yet. What happens in the next 48 hours will haunt this small town for generations, and what that child hears coming from beneath the ground will follow her until her dying breath. The story begins 3 days earlier, in the rural outskirts of Knoxville, where the Harmon family farm sits nestled between rolling hills and dense oak forests. The property sprawls across 40 acres of Tennessee soil, most of it left wild and untamed. The farmhouse itself is modest, weathered wood planks that have seen better decades, a sagging porch that creaks with every step, and windows that rattle when the wind picks up from the valley below. 12-year-old Sarah Harmon wakes before dawn, as she does every morning. The rooster hasn't even begun to crow when she slips out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. She dresses quickly in the darkness, pulling on her worn cotton dress and buttoning it with practiced fingers. Through the thin walls, she can hear her mother's labored breathing in the next room. That sound has become familiar over the past 6 months, a constant reminder that something is terribly wrong. Margaret Harmon has been sick since spring. It started with headaches, severe ones that would leave her bedridden for days. Then came the confusion, moments where she wouldn't recognize her own daughter, where she'd call Sarah by names of people long dead. The local doctor, an older man named Dr. Whitmore who rode out from town twice a month, couldn't explain it. He'd examined Margaret thoroughly, checked her pulse, looked into her eyes, asked questions about her symptoms. Each visit ended the same way, with him shaking his head and muttering about nerves and female hysteria. But Sarah knows it's more than that. She's watched her mother deteriorate week by week, day by day. Margaret's hands shake constantly now. She forgets where she is, sometimes wandering out into the fields in her nightgown at 3 in the morning. Sarah has found her more than once, standing barefoot in the dewy grass, staring at nothing, mumbling words that make no sense. The worst part is the screaming. Late at night, Margaret wakes up screaming, crying out about things crawling inside her head, about voices she can hear but can't understand. Sarah's father left 2 years ago. He simply walked out one morning and never came back. No note, no explanation, just gone. Some folks in town said he ran off with a woman from Chattanooga. Others whispered he'd gotten into debt with the wrong people. Sarah doesn't care about the reasons anymore. All that matters is that she and her mother are alone, and now her mother is slipping away too. The farm work falls entirely on Sarah's shoulders now. She tends to the chickens, collects eggs, feeds the 2 remaining pigs, and maintains the small vegetable garden that provides most of their food. The neighbors help when they can. Mrs. Patterson from the adjacent property brings over bread sometimes, and old Mr. Reeves occasionally drops off firewood. But mostly, it's just Sarah doing everything she can to keep her mother comfortable and the farm from falling completely into ruin. This particular morning feels different. The air is heavy, oppressive, like the atmosphere before a summer thunderstorm. Sarah walks quietly to her mother's room and pushes open the door. Margaret lies in bed, eyes open but unfocused, staring at the ceiling. Her lips move slightly, forming words that never quite make it into sound. Sarah approaches the bed slowly, carrying a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth. Margaret's eyes don't track her daughter's movement. They remain fixed on some invisible point above, as if watching something Sarah cannot see. The room smells of sweat and sickness, despite Sarah's efforts to keep the windows open and the linens fresh. She sets the bowl down on the nightstand and dips the cloth into the water, wringing it out gently. When Sarah touches the cloth to her mother's forehead, Margaret flinches violently. Her hand shoots up and grabs Sarah's wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes finally focus, locking onto her daughter's face with an intensity that makes Sarah's breath catch. Margaret's lips part and she speaks in a voice that sounds nothing like her own, deeper and rougher than it should be. The words that come out make no sense. Margaret speaks rapidly in what sounds like gibberish, her grip on Sarah's wrist tightening until it hurts. Sarah tries to pull away, but her mother won't let go. The nonsensical words continue to pour out faster and faster until Margaret suddenly stops. Her eyes roll back, her body goes limp, and she releases Sarah's wrist. Within seconds, she's unconscious again, her breathing shallow but steady. Sarah stumbles backward, her heart pounding. She's seen her mother confused before, seen her disoriented and lost, but never like this. Never with that look in her eyes, never with that voice. She rubs her wrist where red marks are already forming and tries to steady her breathing. The bowl of water sits forgotten on the nightstand as Sarah backs out of the room, unable to shake the feeling that the woman in that bed isn't entirely her mother anymore. The rest of the day passes in a blur of routine tasks. Sarah goes through the motions mechanically, feeding the animals, collecting eggs, pulling weeds from the garden, but her mind keeps returning to that moment in the bedroom, to the way her mother's hand felt like iron around her wrist, to those strange words that seemed to come from somewhere deep and dark inside her. By late afternoon, Sarah decides she needs help. She can't do this alone anymore. Dr. Whitmore is useless, but maybe the reverend at the church in town would know what to do. Reverend Morrison has been in Knoxville for 20 years, has seen all manner of suffering and sickness. If anyone might have answers, it would be him. Sarah changes into her better dress, the one she wears to church on Sundays. It's faded blue cotton with small white flowers, patched in several places but still presentable. She brushes her dark hair and ties it back with a ribbon. Before leaving, she checks on her mother one more time. Margaret lies exactly as Sarah left her, eyes closed, breathing steadily, looking almost peaceful. The walk to town takes nearly an hour. The dirt road winds through farmland and forest, past properties Sarah has known her entire life. The Henderson place with its red barn, the old Miller house that's been abandoned for 5 years, the creek that runs alongside the road for half a mile before veering off into the woods. The October air carries the smell of dying leaves and distant wood smoke. Other farms are preparing for winter, harvesting the last of their crops, storing food for the cold months ahead. Sarah passes a few people on the road. Mrs. Kelly waves from her wagon, her face showing concern when she sees Sarah walking alone. Old Tom Fletcher tips his hat and asks about Margaret. Sarah gives vague answers, not wanting to explain what's really happening. How could she explain something she doesn't understand herself? How could she describe the way her mother's eyes looked this morning, or the inhuman quality of her voice? Town appears gradually as the road straightens out. First the outlying houses, then the general store, the blacksmith's shop, the schoolhouse where Sarah used to attend before her mother got sick. The church sits at the far end of Main Street, a white wooden building with a modest steeple and a graveyard stretching out behind it. Sarah finds Reverend Morrison in the church office. There's a small room attached to the main building. He's a man in his 50s with greying hair and kind eyes, sitting at a desk covered with papers and books. When Sarah knocks on the open door, he looks up and smiles warmly, but the smile fades when he sees her expression. He invites her to sit, and Sarah does, perching on the edge of a wooden chair that faces his desk. For a moment, she doesn't know how to begin. How do you explain that your mother might be losing her mind, or worse, that something else might be taking it from her? The Reverend waits patiently, his hands folded on the desk, giving her time to find the words. Sarah starts with the facts. She describes the progression of her mother's illness, the headaches that began in spring, the confusion that followed, the wandering at night. She talks about Dr. Whitmore's visits and his inability to diagnose anything specific. Reverend Morrison listens without interrupting, nodding occasionally, his expression growing more concerned as Sarah continues. Then Sarah tells him about this morning, about the way her mother grabbed her wrist, about the strange words and the voice that didn't sound right. She pulls back her sleeve to show the fading red marks on her wrist. As she speaks, she watches the Reverend's face carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. Will he think she's exaggerating? Will he dismiss her concerns the way Dr. Whitmore has? But Reverend Morrison doesn't dismiss her. Instead, he leans back in his chair and is quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant, as if remembering something. When he finally speaks, his voice is measured and careful. He tells Sarah that he's seen similar cases before, years ago, in other places. Illnesses of the mind that doctors couldn't explain, behaviors that seem to come from somewhere beyond the person themselves. He asks Sarah specific questions. Does her mother speak in languages she's never learned? Does she know things she shouldn't know? Does she react violently to religious objects or prayers? Sarah answers as best she can. She doesn't know if the words her mother spoke were another language, or just nonsense. She hasn't tried bringing religious items into the room. Her mother hasn't been conscious enough for prayers. The Reverend stands and walks to a bookshelf, running his finger along the spines until he finds what he's looking for. He pulls out an old leather-bound book and flips through its pages. Sarah watches him, her anxiety growing. Finally, he stops on a particular page and reads silently for a moment before looking back at her. What he tells her next makes Sarah's blood run cold. He explains that sometimes, when a person's mind is weakened by illness or trauma, other things can take hold. He's careful with his words, not wanting to frighten her more than necessary, but the implication is clear. He's talking about possession, about something inhabiting her mother's body. Sarah wants to reject this idea immediately. It sounds like something from old superstitions, from stories meant to scare children. But she thinks about her mother's eyes this morning, about that voice, about the strength in her grip. She thinks about how her mother has been deteriorating in ways that don't make medical sense, and she realizes that maybe the Reverend is right. Maybe this is something beyond ordinary illness. The Reverend offers to come to the farm tomorrow, to see Margaret for himself and to pray over her. He says he'll bring holy water and his Bible, and he'll do what he can to help. Sarah agrees gratefully, feeling a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that someone is taking her seriously, that someone might be able to help. Dread at what it means if the Reverend is right about what's happening to her mother. Sarah leaves the church as the sun begins to set, painting the Tennessee sky in shades of orange and deep purple. The walk home feels longer than the walk to town, partly because darkness is falling, and partly because her mind won't stop racing. She keeps replaying the conversation with Reverend Morrison, turning over his words, trying to make sense of everything. The forest around the road grows darker and more oppressive as night approaches. Shadows lengthen between the trees, and the usual sounds of evening birds and insects seem muted, distant. Sarah walks faster, suddenly anxious to get home, to check on her mother, to make sure nothing has happened in her absence. When she finally sees the farmhouse in the distance, relief floods through her. Lamplight glows in one of the windows, which is odd because Sarah didn't leave any lamps lit. She approaches cautiously, her earlier relief turning to unease. As she gets closer, she hears something that stops her in her tracks. Singing. Someone is singing inside the house. Sarah recognizes her mother's voice, but the song is unfamiliar. The melody is strange, almost tuneless, and the words are in that same incomprehensible language from this morning. Sarah stands frozen on the porch, her hand on the door handle, listening to that eerie song drift through the walls. Her mother hasn't been able to get out of bed in weeks. How is she singing? How is she moving around to light lamps? Taking a deep breath, Sarah pushes the door open. The singing stops immediately. The house falls silent, except for the creak of the floorboards under Sarah's feet as she steps inside. The lamp burns on the kitchen table, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Sarah moves through the house slowly, checking each room, her heart hammering in her chest. When she reaches her mother's bedroom, she finds Margaret exactly where she left her, lying in bed, eyes closed, apparently asleep. But the lamp on the nightstand is lit now, and Sarah knows with absolute certainty that it wasn't lit when she left. She also notices something else. The room is cold, far colder than it should be, and the air has a strange quality to it, thick and heavy. Sarah backs out of the room and closes the door. She doesn't sleep in her own bed that night. Instead, she pulls a chair up against her mother's door and sits there, keeping watch. Every sound makes her jump, every creak of the house settling, every gust of wind against the windows, every distant animal call from the forest. She wraps herself in a blanket and tries to stay alert, but exhaustion pulls at her. Around midnight, the noises begin. They start as scratching sounds, like fingernails on wood, coming from inside her mother's room. Then comes thumping, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone pounding on the floor. Sarah's hands grip the arms of the chair so tightly, her knuckles turn white. She wants to open the door, to check on her mother, but fear keeps her frozen in place. The sounds continue for hours, sometimes loud, sometimes soft, sometimes stopping completely for long stretches before starting again. Sarah sits in that chair, trembling, praying for morning to come, praying for Reverend Morrison to arrive as promised. She thinks about running, about abandoning the house and her mother and fleeing into the night. But where would she go? And how could she leave her mother alone with whatever is happening inside that room? As dawn finally breaks, pale grey light filtering through the windows, the noises stop. The house becomes quiet again, almost peaceful. Sarah's body aches from sitting in the chair all night, and her eyes burn from lack of sleep. She stands slowly, her legs stiff, and approaches her mother's door. She presses her ear against the wood and listens. Nothing. Complete silence. She opens the door carefully, peering inside. Margaret lies in her bed, looking exactly as she did the night before, breathing steadily, apparently at peace. But the room has been disturbed. The lamp has been moved to the floor. The blankets are bunched at the foot of the bed. And on the walls, scratched into the old wood, are symbols Sarah has never seen before. Strange markings that seem to writhe in the early morning light. Sarah doesn't have time to process what she's seeing before she hears the sound of a horse and wagon approaching the farm. Through the window, she sees Reverend Morrison arriving earlier than expected, his expression grave as he climbs down from his wagon. He's brought someone with him, an older woman Sarah recognizes as Mrs. Callahan, who sometimes assists with church matters and is known throughout the community for her knowledge of herbs and healing. Sarah rushes to meet them at the door, and the relief she feels at seeing them is so overwhelming she nearly breaks down. But she holds herself together, knowing she needs to stay strong, needs to explain what happened during the night. The Reverend takes one look at her exhausted face and immediately understands that the situation has worsened. Inside, Sarah leads them to her mother's room. She points out the symbols on the walls, explains the sounds she heard throughout the night, describes how the lamp was moved and the blankets disturbed, even though her mother appeared unconscious the entire time. Reverend Morrison examines the markings closely, his face growing pale. Mrs. Callahan stands at the foot of the bed, studying Margaret with sharp, experienced eyes. The Reverend asks Sarah to leave the room, while he and Mrs. Callahan examine Margaret more thoroughly. Sarah wants to protest, wants to stay and hear everything they say, but she obeys. She waits in the kitchen, pacing back and forth, listening to the muffled voices coming from the bedroom. She can't make out specific words, but the tone is serious, concerned, occasionally alarmed. After what feels like an eternity, but is probably only 20 minutes, they emerge. Reverend Morrison's face is troubled, and Mrs. Callahan looks shaken. They sit Sarah down at the kitchen table, and the Reverend speaks carefully, choosing his words with obvious deliberation. He confirms what he suspected yesterday. Margaret is not simply sick. Something has taken hold of her, something that grows stronger as her body grows weaker. Mrs. Callahan adds her observations. She's seen the physical signs, the way Margaret's pupils don't respond normally to light, the way her body temperature fluctuates between burning hot and ice cold, the strange marks on her skin that appear and disappear. She's also noticed something else, something that makes Sarah's stomach turn. Margaret's body is beginning to change in subtle ways. Her fingernails have grown longer and harder overnight. Her teeth seem sharper. These aren't normal symptoms of any illness Mrs. Callahan has ever encountered. The Reverend explains that they need to act quickly, before whatever is inside Margaret takes complete control. He's brought supplies for a ritual of cleansing, blessed water and oil, specific prayers and incantations that have been used for centuries to drive out malevolent forces. But he's honest with Sarah about the risks. Sometimes these rituals work, sometimes they don't, and sometimes they make things worse. Sarah asks what will happen if they do nothing. The Reverend and Mrs. Callahan exchange a look before answering. If they do nothing, Margaret will likely die, but not before the thing inside her fully manifests. It will use her body for its own purposes, and those purposes are never good. People have been hurt, even killed, by those who have been fully possessed. The Reverend has seen it before in other towns, other circumstances. He doesn't want to see it happen here. They begin preparations immediately. Mrs. Callahan draws the curtains, blocking out the morning sunlight. The Reverend arranges candles around Margaret's bed in a specific pattern. He places his Bible on the nightstand and opens it to passages he's marked with strips of fabric. Sarah is instructed to stay in the doorway, to observe but not to interfere no matter what happens. The ritual begins with prayer, the Reverend's voice strong and clear as he recites verses about protection and deliverance. Margaret remains still at first, appearing unconscious, unaware of what's happening around her. But as the prayers continue, her body begins to react. Her fingers twitch, her eyelids flutter. A low sound starts deep in her throat, almost like a growl. Mrs. Callahan steps forward with the blessed water, sprinkling it over Margaret's forehead and hands. The reaction is immediate and violent. Margaret's eyes snap open, but they're not her eyes anymore. They're completely black, no white visible at all, like pools of darkness. She sits up with unnatural speed, her mouth opening impossibly wide, and she screams. The scream that comes from Margaret's throat doesn't sound human. It's a mixture of rage and pain and something else, something ancient and terrible. The sound fills the room, fills the entire house, seems to shake the very walls. Sarah claps her hands over her ears, but it doesn't help. The scream penetrates everything, vibrating in her bones, making her teeth ache. Reverend Morrison doesn't stop. He raises his voice, speaking his prayers louder, more forcefully, holding his Bible up like a shield. Mrs. Callahan continues with the blessed water, her hands shaking but determined. Margaret thrashes on the bed, her movements jerky and wrong, like a puppet being controlled by someone who doesn't quite know how bodies should move. Then Margaret speaks, and her voice is that same deep, rough voice Sarah heard yesterday morning, but amplified, more powerful. She speaks in multiple languages. Some Sarah recognizes as foreign tongues she's heard travelers use, others that sound like nothing human should be able to produce. The words pour out in a stream of blasphemy and threats, directed at the Reverend, at Mrs. Callahan, at Sarah standing frozen in the doorway. The entity inside Margaret knows things it shouldn't know. It speaks about Reverend Morrison's past, about mistakes he made as a younger man, about secrets he's kept hidden for decades. It tells Mrs. Callahan about her dead children, describes their deaths in horrible detail, uses their voices to call out to her. It's trying to break them, trying to make them stop the ritual, and Sarah can see it's working. Mrs. Callahan is crying, her hands trembling so badly she nearly drops the bottle of blessed water. But the Reverend persists. He splashes holy water directly onto Margaret's face, and smoke rises where it touches her skin. Margaret shrieks and recoils, her body convulsing. The smell of burning flesh fills the room, making Sarah gag. She wants to run forward, to help her mother, but Mrs. Callahan holds up a hand, warning her to stay back. The struggle continues for what feels like hours, but is probably only 30 minutes. Margaret fights against invisible restraints, her voice growing hoarser as she screams and curses. The Reverend reads passage after passage, his voice never wavering, though sweat pours down his face and his hands shake with exhaustion. Mrs. Callahan assists, adding her own prayers in a language Sarah doesn't understand, perhaps something from her Irish ancestors. Then suddenly, Margaret falls back onto the bed. Her body goes completely limp, and the black fades from her eyes, replaced by her normal hazel color. For a moment there's absolute silence. Everyone holds their breath, waiting to see what happens next. Margaret's eyes focus on Sarah, really seeing her for the first time in days, and tears start rolling down her cheeks. In a weak, broken voice that's entirely her own, Margaret speaks. She tells Sarah she's sorry, so sorry for everything. She says she can feel it inside her, this thing that's been growing stronger, taking more control. She describes it as darkness, as something cold and hateful that wants to consume her completely. She's been fighting it, trying to hold on, but she's so tired. She doesn't know how much longer she can resist. The Reverend moves closer, his voice gentle now. He asks Margaret when this started, how it began. Margaret's answer is halting, interrupted by sobs and moments where she struggles to find words. She says it started with dreams, terrible dreams about something waiting in the dark, something that wanted to come through. Then one morning, about 6 months ago, she woke up and felt something else inside her mind, another presence, another will that wasn't her own. She tried to fight it, tried to ignore it, but it grew stronger every day. The headaches were from the effort of resisting. The confusion was when it took partial control. The screaming at night was when they battled for dominance of her own body. She's been losing that battle gradually, inch by inch, and she knows what will happen when she loses completely. The thing inside her has shown her visions, has let her see what it plans to do with her body once it has full control. Margaret begs them not to let that happen. She'd rather die than become a vessel for this evil thing. She looks at Sarah with such desperate love and such profound sadness that Sarah finally breaks down, rushing to her mother's side, despite Mrs. Callahan's warning. She takes Margaret's hand, and for a moment they're just mother and daughter again, holding on to each other while the world falls apart around them. Reverend Morrison pulls Sarah aside, while Mrs. Callahan stays with Margaret, who has fallen into an exhausted sleep. He speaks in low tones, his face grave. The ritual has weakened the entity temporarily, driven it back, but it hasn't expelled it completely. That would require something more powerful, something he's not equipped to do. There are specialists, priests trained specifically in dealing with possessions, but the nearest one is in Louisville, Kentucky, at least 3 days' travel away. They don't have 3 days. The Reverend can see what Sarah has seen, the physical changes already beginning in Margaret's body. The entity is adapting, merging itself with her in ways that will soon become irreversible. Once that happens, even the most powerful exorcism won't work, because there won't be enough of Margaret left to save. They're looking at hours, maybe a day at most, before the point of no return. Sarah asks what they can do. The Reverend's answer makes her blood run cold. There's only one sure way to stop a possession once it reaches this stage, one way to prevent the entity from using Margaret's body for whatever dark purposes it has. The body must die before the entity takes complete control. It's a terrible choice, an impossible choice, but it's the only one that guarantees the thing inside Margaret won't hurt anyone else. Sarah rejects this immediately. She won't kill her mother. She can't. There has to be another way, some option they haven't considered. But the Reverend gently explains that Margaret herself has asked for this. During the moments when she was lucid, when she understood what was happening, she made him promise. She doesn't want to become something evil. She doesn't want her body used to harm others, especially not her daughter. Mrs. Callahan emerges from the bedroom, her expression confirming everything the Reverend has said. Margaret is awake again and she wants to speak with Sarah alone. Sarah enters the bedroom with her heart breaking. Her mother looks small and frail in the bed, barely recognizable as the strong woman who raised her, who kept the farm running after Sarah's father left, who sacrificed everything for her daughter's well-being. Margaret takes Sarah's hand weakly. She speaks slowly, each word an effort, but she's clear and coherent. She tells Sarah that she loves her, that she's proud of the young woman she's become, that she's sorry she won't be there to see her grow older. She explains that the thing inside her is evil, genuinely evil in a way most people never encounter in their entire lives. It's shown her what it will do if it gains full control, and she can't allow that to happen. She asks Sarah to do something terrible, something no child should ever have to do. When the time comes, when Margaret can no longer fight back, when the entity takes over completely, Sarah must end it, not as murder but as mercy, as protection for both Margaret's soul and everyone else's safety. Margaret makes Sarah promise, extracting the words from her reluctant daughter, knowing that this burden will haunt Sarah for the rest of her life, but seeing no other choice. Sarah promises through her tears, though every part of her rebels against the idea. Margaret seems to relax slightly, some of the tension leaving her body. She tells Sarah about a place on the property, a spot in the forest where the earth is soft, where large oak trees create a natural sanctuary. That's where she wants to be laid to rest, not in the town cemetery where the thing inside her might somehow linger or corrupt the ground. They talk for a few more minutes, Margaret sharing memories, giving Sarah advice about running the farm, about staying strong, about finding happiness despite the darkness that's touched their lives. Then Margaret's eyes start to change again, the hazel color darkening, and she gasps. She tells Sarah to leave, to get out now, before it comes back. Sarah hesitates, but Margaret screams at her to go, using the last of her own will to force the words out. Sarah flees the room, and behind her, she hears her mother's voice change, deepening into that terrible sound. The entity is returning, stronger than before, angry at being temporarily driven back. The Reverend and Mrs. Callahan rush into the room, but this time their prayers seem less effective. The thing inside Margaret is adapting, learning to resist their efforts. For the next several hours, they take turns trying to hold the entity at bay, but it's a losing battle. Each time they drive it back, it returns faster and stronger. Margaret's moments of lucidity become shorter and farther apart. The physical changes accelerate. Her body temperature spikes, her skin takes on a greyish pallor, her eyes remain black more often than not. Night falls on the second day, and everyone is exhausted. Mrs. Callahan has fallen asleep in a chair, unable to continue. Reverend Morrison sits in the kitchen with Sarah, both of them drinking strong coffee, trying to stay awake and alert. They can hear Margaret moving around in her room, speaking in that inhuman voice, sometimes laughing in a way that makes their skin crawl. The Reverend tells Sarah it's time. They've done everything they can and Margaret is almost gone. The entity will have full control by morning, if not sooner. He asks Sarah if she remembers her promise to her mother. Sarah nods, tears streaming down her face. She knows what needs to be done, but knowing doesn't make it any easier. They discuss methods, and the Reverend suggests something that seems merciful at first, but becomes horrifying as Sarah understands the full implication. They cannot simply end Margaret's life in the house. The entity might linger here, might attach itself to the property or to Sarah herself. They need to ensure it's contained, trapped with Margaret's body, in a way that prevents it from escaping. The Reverend's suggestion is ancient, drawn from practices that predate Christianity, from times when people understood that some evils needed to be bound to the earth itself. Margaret must be buried while the entity is still trapped in her body, buried deep enough that it cannot escape in ground that will hold it secure. The timing is crucial. Too soon, and they're murdering a woman who might still fight free. Too late, and the entity will be too powerful to contain. Sarah feels sick as she understands what he's really saying. Her mother must be buried alive, at the exact moment when she's transitioning from possessed to fully consumed. It's the only way to ensure the entity dies with her, trapped in the earth before it can manifest fully. The Reverend assures her that Margaret won't suffer long, that the lack of air will cause unconsciousness quickly, that it's more merciful than it sounds. But Sarah knows better. She knows her mother will be aware, at least for a few terrible minutes. She'll know she's being buried, know that her own daughter is sealing her in the ground. It's barbaric and cruel, but the alternative is worse. If the entity takes complete control, there's no telling what it might do with Margaret's body, how many people it might hurt. They wake Mrs. Callahan and explain the plan. She's horrified, but agrees there's no other option. They gather supplies, shovels, rope, lanterns. The Reverend says prayers over each item, blessing them for the grim work ahead. Sarah moves through these preparations in a daze, her mind refusing to fully accept what she's about to do. Around midnight, they enter Margaret's room one final time. The woman on the bed barely resembles Sarah's mother anymore. Her features have become sharper, more predatory. Her movements are fluid and unnatural. When she sees them enter, she smiles with too many teeth, and her voice drips with mockery as she tells them they're too late, that the body is hers now, that nothing they do can stop what's coming. But then, for just a moment, Margaret breaks through. Her eyes clear, and she looks at Sarah with desperate pleading. She mouths the word now, and Sarah understands. This is the moment, the narrow window between possession and complete transformation. If they wait any longer, they'll lose any chance of containing the entity. They move quickly. The Reverend and Mrs. Callahan restrain Margaret, while Sarah runs to prepare the gravesite. She takes a lantern and shovel to the place her mother described, the sanctuary among the oak trees. The ground is indeed soft here, dark earth that yields easily to the shovel. Sarah digs with frantic energy, driven by adrenaline and horror and desperate love. The grave doesn't need to be deep, just deep enough. 3 feet, maybe 4. Sarah digs until her hands blister, and her back screams with pain. She digs until she's created a hole roughly the size and shape of a human body. Then she returns to the house, where the Reverend and Mrs. Callahan have managed to wrap Margaret in blankets and rope, creating a kind of restraining cocoon. Margaret is screaming now, alternating between her own voice begging for help and the entity's voice promising terrible retribution. Sarah helps carry her mother's thrashing body out to the woods, to the grave waiting in the darkness. They lay her in the hole, and for just a moment Margaret's eyes meet Sarah's. There's recognition there, and love, and terrible fear. Then Sarah begins shoveling earth over her mother's body. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.